please be seated? Thank you all for joining us this evening for the Dean's Lecture Series. As most of you know, there'll be a question and answer period following the lecture after about a 10-minute break, and that's in the room on the right-hand side at the end of the hall. It's my pleasure to introduce Alan Levine. His lecture this evening is entitled The Idea of America in European Political Thought. Alan Levine is professor in the Department of Government at American University in Washington, D.C. He also teaches regularly in the Hertog Political Science Program, a summer program from which many of our students have benefited. In addition to these teaching posts, Professor Levine has taught at Princeton, Stanford, the University of London, the University of Vermont, and Harvard University, where he also completed his doctoral work on Montaigne under the advisement of Harvey Mansfield, Judith Sklar, Stephen Macedo, and Peter Berkowitz. Over the course of his career, he's received 9 awards for excellence in teaching. These awards are spread liberally throughout the schools where he has taught. In addition to his excellent teaching, he's written several books, the titles of which are A Political Companion to Ralph Waldo Emerson, Sensual Philosophy, Toleration, Skepticism, and Montaigne's Politics of Self, and Early Modern Skepticism and the Origins of Toleration. He's currently working on 4 manuscripts. Please join me this evening. Please join me this evening in welcoming Professor Levine.
Well, thank you very much, Lise, for that introduction, and thank you to the Dean and Michael Grenke for the invitation to come out here. I have great admiration for St. John's. I myself went to a great book school, although when I applied at the University of Chicago, although when I went, I didn't know that I wanted a great book school. I didn't know that it was a great book school or even what that meant until I got there, and I realized, yes, this is what I've been looking for my whole life. So all of you students here, you're a lot smarter and know yourself better than I did when I was your age, and but 4 years goes by fast. Really take advantage of it. And one other thing that I just wanted to say in advance is that this is part of a manuscript that I'm working on that I hope to finish in the next year or 2. So I very seriously welcome suggestions, and if there's things that I omitted or didn't get quite right, I hope you'll let me know in the Q&A afterwards or send me an email. So my topic is very ambitious. I'm covering 524 years of history, and I'm going to talk to you about it in about 60 minutes. So I'm not a quantitative political scientist, but I can do math. That breaks down to 8.73 years per minute, or talking about 1 year in less than 7 seconds. Now, there might be some years in European philosophers' views of America in which 7 seconds would be enough, but there's plenty of years in which that's not enough. So you'll see that my project is very ambitious. I want to be clear about my topic. It is not on America or American political thought. It's on European views of America. So I'm trying to do the twist to see America as the other. America, we're always told, we don't see the other. Now, America as the other. And America is a great symbol, and perhaps the greatest symbol of modern times, and right up there with the greatest symbols of all times. Athens representing philosophy, Jerusalem representing biblical religion, Rome in both its pagan and Catholic senses, maybe Mecca. But what does America stand for? There's common things that we know. Roads paved with gold, the city on a hill, the great Satan, Michael Jackson, McDonald's, blue jeans. But there's a very different America that is less known, but quite influential in Europe and increasingly around the world. And to give you a taste of this at the beginning, I'm going to read a quote from French novelist Henri de Montalon. Quote, "One nation that manages to lower intelligence, morality, human quality on nearly all the surface of the earth, such a thing has never been seen before in the existence of the planet. J'accuse the United States of being in a permanent state of crime against humankind." Let's parse that for a second. We lower intelligence and morality, so your intellectual and moral virtues, human quality, and not just on the territory that the U.S. controls, but on nearly the entire surface of the earth in a way that's unprecedented in history. That is what this other view of America is. Now, my book and my talk today is intended to be the first comprehensive look at European philosophers' views of America. Many others have written on parts of what I'm talking about, either the Indians or the US, and certainly people have talked about the views of every author that I'm talking about tonight. But by looking at the full 500 plus years of views on America, I'm going to argue that you can see patterns that you can't see if you don't look at the whole thing. And so I don't have to go year by year, I think we'll see that the European philosophers' views of America break down into 4 unique periods. Now, if my time frame is huge, my focus is narrow. I'm looking at what philosophers and political theorists say about America, not literary figures, random travelers, scientists, or crackpots, many of whom have written on America. Now, I try to put the political theorists in the context of the general views of the time, of what the society-wide debates and views of America, so we can see what, if anything, is unique to the political theory debates. And I think we'll see that there are real patterns. So what is revealed? We'll learn something about America, but we'll learn much more about Europe. We'll see that America is condemned, praised, condemned again, and that these changes are not primarily explained by changes in America itself. They're explained by Europe's desires and fears for Europe. Ideology, it turns out, is not a key factor, but what I'll argue is that the battle over America is a proxy war over the value of European civilization, the Enlightenment, liberalism, and modernity itself. And let me first begin with a few definitions. What do I mean by America? In the first half of my talk, America is all the Americas, because the European thinkers are talking about the Indians, and they just kind of lump them all together. In the second half of my talk, I'm talking only about the United States. So what I mean by America changes. I want to be very clear about that. But in doing that, I'm merely following the change in the European philosophical discourse. What do I mean by Europe? Nothing special. I include the UK, I go to the Urals, but I don't look at what is said in every single country at every single moment in time. In each of my periods, there's a general debate or discourse that dominates all of European thought, and that's where it's really at, in those 1 or 2 countries, and the rest kind of tag along. And what do I mean by modernity? When I give this talk to political scientists, I have to really belabor what I mean by modernity, because to them, modern was like 10 years ago. But at St. John's, I'm going to hope that I don't have to explain what I mean by modernity. But just in case, I mean modern as opposed to traditional societies in Max Weber's view, right? Enchanted, mystical. In contrast to that, modern is the demystified world. I mean modern as opposed to ancient and medieval in the political theory and big historical sense. So whereas the ancient world got guidance from nature understood through reason, and the medieval world got guidance from revelation through the revealed word of God, in modernity, it rejects nature and God as moral standards for human beings and replaces it with the subjective desires of individuals. So viewed positively, modernity leads to individual political and moral freedom, the ability for social and self-experimentation and self-development, science and technology, the conquest of nature, the ability to rearrange the world for our desires to have heat in the winter and cold in the summer and iPods and all of that. Viewed negatively, this change to modernity leads to a loss of horizon that gives life meaning, a loss of roots and a sense of community, a hubris that denies human limits, a hubris that denies dependence on God or history, an overestimation of the powers of frail and fallible human reason. Life becomes one of trivial self-indulgence, and humans lose heroic sensibility, taste for grandeur. So it's hard to have it all. You can't have stable, reassuring, rooted traditional communities and individual freedom and self-experimentation. It's hard to have technology based on science that sees everything as mere matter and motion and have an enchanted sacred world full of sacred beings with their own integrity. And this is the problem of modern times. We can't have it all. There is no utopia, or if there is, it's not modernity. Why does my topic matter? If America was never discovered or the United States not founded, I ask, how would political philosophy, Europe, or the world be different? And I think they would, and we'll see that America is a crystallizing image both of Europe's past and future, and that if the US didn't exist, Europe never would have considered liberalism and modernity inevitable in a way that it did for a long time. So with that kind of preliminary, let me turn to my 4 periods. I'm going to run through the 4 periods. I'm going to have a conclusion, an epilogue, and more conclusion. So, first period. The first period is characterized by attempts to fit America into pre-existing knowledge. And this is these are the first attempts to explain America. It goes roughly from 1492 into the 1600s, and I'll talk first about Columbus and the explorers' views, and then the political theorists. So the first is to sort of the general view of the time. Columbus was mistaken from the first. He thought he was in Asia. Columbus took 4 different voyages to America. To the day he died, he thought he had found a way to Asia. He never thought that America was its own continent. The early modern map makers credited Amerigo Vespucci for the one who saw that America was its own continent. Hence, we are the United States of America, after Amerigo's first name. If we would have been named after his last name, we'd be the United States of Vespuccia. Now, not only was Columbus mistaken about where he was, but he was mistaken about the people that he found too. And in general, he hardly ever shows curiosity in the beliefs and institutions of the people, except to know how to manipulate them. And Columbus, in his own writings, is a very odd mixture of modern and medieval. So he's modern. Part of the time, he could be an anthropologist and, sort of just the facts. And so he goes, and the Indians, they have brown skin. It's darker than the Europeans, but lighter than the Africans. They have black hair like the Africans, but it's straight, not curly like the Africans, right? This is just straightforward anthropological. But at the same time, and in the next breath, Columbus claims to have found cannibals, Amazons, dog-faced people, people with tails, cyclops, and sirens. You're allowed to laugh at that. Now, what in the world is going on? I'm going to assume that Columbus actually found none of those. So what's going on? Now, in fact, to his credit, Columbus never actually claims to have seen any of these, but he just claims to have been told they're on the next island over as he's sailing around. Now, how does that come up in conversation? Right? Here's people with no common language with you, and you think what they're telling you is there's dog-faced people over there? There's cannibals? How does that happen? I think the only way that happens is if Columbus is asking the questions. Hey, are there any cannibals around? And, well, they have the name of Caribs. So Carib, right? And maybe over there, right? I found the cannibals. Now, where is this coming from? This comes from a long tradition throughout Christendom that actually starts with Herodotus. And Herodotus, you read him here, right? You know Herodotus, he travels around and he reports what the stories of different peoples. And Herodotus clearly doesn't believe the stories that he's reporting. He always says, they say, they believe that, they claim that this happened, right? But in early Christendom, there's a series of encyclopedists who weren't very subtle readers of Herodotus, and they pull this out and they record it as if it's simply true. And so you get books, and there's the cannibals here and the sirens here and all of that. And throughout the medieval times, if you ever looked at medieval maps, they often have a kind of geographically accurate presentation of Eurasia, which they know, and then they have these islands floating around on the edges. And this is the island of the Cyclops, this is the island of the dog-faced people, etc. And so I think Columbus was going, and he was clearly finding what he was expecting to find. And that's important. For him, the land was potential wealth, the people converts and slaves. The Indians themselves had no integrity, no independent status. They were just there to be used according to his own preconceptions. And all the other travelers treat the Indians the same. So what's the political theory debate about all of this? There's three views that dominated throughout the Spanish Renaissance. And the first view is that the Indians were the concrete embodiment of Aristotle's natural slave. And they thought, well, Aristotle had articulated this category, but he never saw any, and the Spanish just found them in the New World. That was the argument. It was first started by a Scot studying in Paris named John Mayer, and it was really expounded by Palacios Rubios and a guy named Sepulveda. The problem with this view is that, in Christian times, there's a problem with this view that didn't exist in pagan times, because the idea was that everyone understood that the Indians were somehow defective, somehow weird and strange. So it's only sort of a small leap in the minds of these people to say it's because they didn't have reason at all, right? That's Aristotle's natural slave. They don't have reason. They can follow reason, they can follow orders, but they don't possess reason. But if God created a whole category of beings that were somehow defective, because in some sense they're human, they have human bodies, but in another sense they don't have reason, so they're not really human, like what's up with that? And God wouldn't create a whole category of defective beings. So that was the problem with that interpretation that led to a second interpretation, and this was most powerfully articulated by Francisco Vitoria. And he argued that, in fact, the Indians were fully rational, using Aristotelian categories again, that they had language, economics, and politics, the key stepping stones in Book 1, Chapter 2 of Aristotle's Politics. He argued they were just underdeveloped. They needed tutelage, and this had to be the Spanish mission. They had to be governed by consent, but because they were underdeveloped, not by their actual formal consent, but what they would consent to based on natural law, which of course the Spanish possessed. The third view was articulated by Las Casas, a Dominican preacher, actually had himself appointed the defender of the Indians. It was an official title that he had, and whenever there were courts in Spain arguing about the future of the Indians, he went there and argued. He argued that the Indians, and indeed all the peoples of the world, were fully human, fully rational, and that they had to give their actual formal consent to Spanish behavior. But he still thought that they needed Christianity and they needed to be civilized. But that just the Spanish should try and do that, but they had to do it in accordance with the Indians' formal consent. So in this whole first period, it never occurs to any of the Spanish, Columbus, Sepulveda, Vittoria, Las Casas, that their cosmology might be incorrect, that their beliefs might not be true, that their institutions might not be legitimate. And because they had such confidence in themselves, it led to the rejection of the other and the view of the Indians as barbaric. Now, the second period. This starts about 1580 and goes to 1776 or beyond. And so amidst the Spanish debate about whether the Indians were the non- or semi-human natural slaves or fully human but underdeveloped, Michel de Montaigne breaks a radical new way of thinking about the Indians. A skeptic and keen observer of human diversity, Montaigne argues that, quote, each man calls barbarism whatever is not his practice, for indeed it seems we have no other test of truth and reason than the example and pattern of the opinions and customs of the country in which we live. So unlike the Spanish, Montaigne doubts the standards of the time and place in which he lives. But this does not lead him to postulate a kind of relativistic equality of all cultures like we might do today. Instead, he argues that, in fact, the Indians are the best society that ever was, real or imaginary, exceeding even the imaginations of the ancient philosophers. He says they're the most natural people who have ever lived. They have habitude naturale, because they have habits and customs like all people, but as natural as possible. They have simple and tranquil characters, and society exists with, quote, little artifice and human solder. He says, quote, those people are wild, and the word wild is sauvage, they're savage, just as we call wild the fruits that nature has produced by herself in her normal course. So savagery or wildness is redefined as the natural. The Indians are, quote, still very close to their original naturalness and live in, quote, a state of purity according to the, quote, les lois naturelles, natural laws, which he says still rule them. By contrast, he describes Europe as having strayed from the natural order and therefore as being corrupt and artificial. The Indians do fight, and they eat their prisoners, but not for economic gain, but as a kind of aristocratic struggle for mastery that he describes as tout noble, wholly noble, and as excusable as this natural disease can be. So even in Montaigne's kind of utopia here, because he knows that this is not how the Indians actually live, even in his utopia there's this fighting, but what he does is create this idea of the noble savage. Now, we can talk in the Q&A why I'm so convinced that he knows that this isn't real, and he's got other descriptions of the Indians and the Aztecs killing 50,000 people a year and all sorts of horrible things. But those are in other places. Here, I think he's trying to articulate an ideal of nature. And he says that he's not sorry that we recognize the barbarity of their cannibalism, but he wishes that we his contemporary Europeans, recognize their own barbarity. And he says, they eat people after they're dead, but we eat people alive. What does he mean? He talks about burning people at the stake and the torture that was common in Europe at the time in the religious wars. And compared to that, eating people after they're dead is not so bad. It's not so horrific. Now, Montaigne does not accurately represent the Indians. Does this doom his project, or what does this mean? Well, if you're going to get inaccurate press, better good than bad, you might argue. But what Montaigne is really about is he's more interested in using the Indians as a vehicle to criticize Europe. And so he invents this idea of the noble savage, which becomes a billy club that from then until today is used to bash civilized society. Montaigne changes the debate. After him, no major political philosopher doubts the Indians are human. Indeed, the Indians are associated with natural man par excellence. All agree with Locke's famous statement, "In the beginning, all the world was America." Everyone agrees that America was Europe's past. The question is that state of nature a brutishness to overcome, Hobbes, or an innocence to recapture, Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot? That's the new debate. And this debate, after Montaigne, unfolds in a single direction. From Hobbes, in his state of nature is terrible, nasty, brutish, and short. You'll do anything to get out of it, right? To even have an absolute despot. To Locke and Montesquieu, where the state of nature isn't nearly that bad, but it's not ideal, it's inconvenient. To Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot, who describe the state of nature as naturally good, people are innocent and happy, and then the civilized man that's corrupt, avaricious, hypocritical, jealous, cruel, and living between divided authorities of political, religious, and natural law. Now, you might not have noticed that Hobbes, just to link this to America, Hobbes gives 3 examples of the state of nature: international relations, civil war, and America. Locke gives 2 examples of the state of nature: international relations and America. And Rousseau, Voltaire, and Diderot give many examples of natural man, of which the most common is America. So those are the facts during this period, the second period, this after Montaigne, increasing praise of the Indians. Now, how can we explain this? So now I'm going to go into interpretation, right? Can we explain this because the Indians themselves, in fact, changed? No, the Indians are not getting happier over the 100 years between 1650 and 1750, right? They're increasingly being wiped out. So you can't explain this change as an accurate reflection of changes in the New World. Can you say maybe it's because even if there was not new change, there weren't real changes in the New World like that, maybe there's new information about the New World that the philosophers were reflecting. And that's not the case either. From the very beginning of the discovery of America, in European society as a whole, the Indians were described as both good and bad from the very beginning all the way through. And these polemics are caught up in arguments of Catholics versus Protestants, because Spain is the main colonial power in the New World, so Catholics describe the Indians as bad and so justify Spanish behavior. Protestants say the Indians are good to criticize them. And all sorts of polemics in Spain versus her enemies, nobles versus kings, dynastic struggles, scientific degeneration theory. And in truth, the actual evidence about the Indians is barely considered at all by any philosophers. And so from the very beginning, they knew about the Aztecs and the Incas and their great civilizations. And so this whole idea of sort of atomistic man walking around in the forest, was just sort of inaccurate, and they knew it. So my view, what's going on in this pattern, that the philosophers are using the Indians for their own ends. As dissatisfaction increases with European institutions, praise of America as another increases. And so you have, over time, as the Ancien regime becomes more stable from Hobbes' time, the philosophers start demanding more and more things. And they're arguing for a kind of liberal modernity, where all people are free and equal and should be ruled by their consent. That's the whole point of the state of nature teaching, right? Is to lead to that kind of politics. And they call for it more and more vociferously as time goes on. So again, the argument over the Indians is really more about European debates, not the reality in America. They use America to promote their vision of what they want for individuals and legitimate institutions. So now this brings us to the third period. The third period is where we starting in 1776, it's reactions to the American Revolution. And here in my narrative, I'm changing from America representing natural man in the Indians to America representing natural rights in the United States institutions. And I'll capture this first with a quote from Condorcet. And this quote starts with a quote from Voltaire that mentions Montesquieu. Okay, so here's the beginning of the quote, and this is from Voltaire. "The human race had lost its rights. Montesquieu found them and restored them to us." That's what Voltaire says. And when he says Montesquieu, I think it could have just as easily been Locke or any of the other philosophers like this. And now Condorcet continues, "It is not enough, however, that these rights be written in the philosopher's works and engraved in the heart of virtuous men. It is necessary that the ignorant or feeble man be able to read them in the example of a great people. America has given us this example. Its Declaration of Independence is a simple exposition of these rights, so sacred and so long forgotten. Among no nation have they been so well known or preserved in such perfect integrity." Okay, so follow the bouncing ball here. You've got European philosophers, Montesquieu and Locke, who come up with an idea of natural rights, in part based on what they say the Indians of America are like. That inspires other Europeans to go to America and set up institutions to realize that vision of natural rights. And those institutions sadly get rid of the original inhabitants of America. But then those institutions in America inspire a new generation of European philosophers to try to create those institutions in Europe. And so Condorcet, the author of this quotation, was the author of the Girondin Constitution of 1793 in the French Revolution, their great liberal constitution. So the ball in America and European philosophers keeps bouncing back and forth. Now, in general, European philosophers and their initial reaction to the American Revolution describe it in just unbelievable terms. The substance of it has to do with promoting self-government that's compatible with stability, with all sorts of freedom of the press, of conscience, of religion, of the institutional praise, that it embodies all Enlightenment ideals, so you have freedom and equality and reason and virtue, and it's just going to progress the world through the roof. And so here's a few quotations that say this. Turgot writes that America is the hope of the world and should, quote, become a model to it. A couple of others, Diderot, in a work by Raynal that Diderot wrote parts of, is describing people's reaction to the American Revolution in the future. And he says, "Your descendants will read about them, the founders of the U.S. One day, with holy respect, they will say, 'These are the men who have freed half the world, and who, working for our happiness before we were even conceived, prevented our being born to the sound of chains banging on our cradles.'" He describes America as a place of free air. A place exists in, quote, "a place exists in the world where people can cast off their chains, where persecuted humanity has raised up its head again, where the harvest grows for the poor, where the laws are no more than the guarantee of happiness, where religion is free and conscience is no longer a slave, where nature finally seems to want to be justified in having created man, and where the government, for so long so guilty all over the earth, finally made good its its crimes. Crèvecoeur describes the United States as the union of virtue and enlightenment. But perhaps the greatest praise of the United States is by someone named Richard Price, a British political thinker, who is most known today because Edmund Burke wrote his piece on the French Revolution in reaction to Price's piece on the French Revolution. But Richard Price said, with heartfelt satisfaction, I see, this is about the American Revolution, I see the revolution in favor of universal liberty which has taken place in America, a revolution which opens up a new prospect in human affairs and begins a new era in the history of mankind, a new era. He says it will raise the species higher, and he compares it to opening a new sense, taste, touch, smell, sight, hearing, America. Now that's not quite as crazy as it seems, because since Hobbes in modern times, people have wondered, where does morality come from, right? The Hobbists just say, morality is all made up and it's whatever the law and people agree it should be. And other people said, no, that's totally an unacceptable account of morality. Morality has a natural basis. But the problem with that view is you look around and people don't act morally. So what's the natural basis of it? So Richard Price is trying to split the difference. And he wants to say, morality does have a natural basis, but not everybody feels it all the time. It has to be activated. And America is going to activate this moral sense in the world now. This is why it's a new era. And so therefore, he concludes that next to the introduction of Christianity among mankind, the American Revolution may prove the most important step in the progressive course of human development. Right? Jesus, the Savior of the world, American Revolution. High praise indeed. Now, these thinkers all recognized that slavery was an evil, and they said that America, the United States, would be judged by the expeditious way in which they got rid of it. They understood it just couldn't be banished all at once. They were willing to give the U.S. time, but they said it really had to go. Now, this all changes with the French Revolution. In the 19th century, or so I argue, in the 19th century, there's not a single figure, well, in the 19th century and until today, there's not a single figure who gives such unalloyed praise of the United States. Everyone in the 19th and 20th century, at best, has ambiguous and ambivalent praise of the United States. Why? Did the United States change from after 1776 and 1787 for the worse? No. I mean, you could, right? Obviously not. So what's the change? The change, I argue, comes with the French Revolution. The French Revolution was so hideous, leading to an official policy of terror by the Jacobins and ending in the dictatorship of Napoleon. After that, all European thinkers allowed the horrors of the French Revolution to color their view of the American Revolution. Now, it didn't have to be this way. They could have said, hey, before we really praised the American Revolution, and we expected the same from the French, but the French got it wrong, so this is even more reason to praise the American Revolution. But not a single one does that. Instead, America becomes ambivalent. And this is captured, this ambivalence that the Europeans feel in the 19th century because they lose the hope of the inevitability of progress, partly so. And so this is summarized by a historian, Arnold Hauser, who wrote, quote, longing for the past while yearning for the future, they found only disenchantment with the present, right? The Ancien regime was gone. What was going to replace it wasn't there yet. The 19th century was like this in-between phase. Alfred de Musset, a romantic poet at the end of the century, said, everything that was is no more. Everything that will be is not yet. Look no further for the secret of our troubles. Now, what's this have to do with America? Well, throughout the 19th century, America comes to be seen as Europe's future. Right? That's why Tocqueville comes to America and going to America, he sees something that feels inevitable, that this is coming to Europe soon, right? And so in going to America, he's glimpsing the future. Hegel also says that America is the future. He means something totally different by it, but America is the future for him too. Now, in the 19th century as a whole, there are some general societal critiques. And I divide these in two parts, what I call Old Europe's Revenge, and then there's views of novelists. And Old Europe's Revenge, I'll give you two examples of Talleyrand, the great foreign minister. And Talleyrand knew everybody. He had to flee France. He went to Philadelphia, which is the great capital of America, the intellectual capital, the home of Ben Franklin, of William Penn. I didn't talk about them, but we could. And Talleyrand writes back, he writes this to everyone, such as this letter to Madame de Staël: "If I had to spend 1 year here, I'd kill myself." What's he trying to do? He's trying to say that, well, this so-called success of the American Revolution is terrible in order to discredit the French Revolution. A historian of the time, French historian of the time, contrasting the United States to the terror of the French Revolution, calls America un vrai terrorisme, a true terrorism, not in its policies, in its being. When it comes to the novelists, they flesh this out for us. Stendhal in the Chartreuse de Parme, in the Charterhouse of Parma, has a character say he would die of boredom after a few weeks in America, that they live like beasts there, and besides, there's no opera. Balzac in Lost Illusions and Eugénie Grandet has people summarize the American mottos as God is gold, life is business. Dostoevsky has, in The Brothers Karamazov, has a guy deciding between going to America and committing suicide. It's a toss-up. It's hard to decide. Dickens in American Notes says he trembles for a radical there in America because of the conformity. And so in general, they talk about commercial crassness and conformity. Now, the political theorists point to some of these same factors, but they link it all to politics, to democracy is what's at the root cause of this, not just commercialism. And so throughout the 19th century, there's general agreement amongst the theorists about the problems, such as the self-interested individualism of the new commercial society, the centralization of power by the new middle-class regime, that's criticized by Constant, Donald, and Mill, the disorder caused by collapsing institutions, authority of experience, age, birth, genius, talent, virtue are all questioned. The growing obsession with money, the unchecked equality and the preference of it to liberty that Tocqueville, Mill, and Burckhardt point out so powerfully. The power of the majority that Tocqueville, Mill, and Constant complain about. Now, throughout the 19th century, all the major thinkers agree with the basic substantive critique of America. The only difference is what they want to do about it. And so the far left looks at America and they say, well, this is way better than the Ancien regime. But it's not real liberty and real equality. For that, we need a revolution of some kind, socialist, communist, anarchist. And they want to push through America to that second wave of modernity. On the right, they look at American constitutionalism and the dissolute individualism that it protects, and they say, this is terrible. We need to go back to order and hierarchy of church and king of the Ancien regime. And for those sides, their ideology tells them everything they need to know about America in advance. It's only the liberal center that says, yes, the liberal modernity of the United States is much better than the Ancien regime, and they have no hope of some kind of utopian revolution. They say, this is as good as it's going to get. So we have to study America seriously and look for the resources within America and this liberal modernity to solve the problems entailed in it. And that's what Tocqueville does so brilliantly. I'll just read you a few lines from this period, from the right and left. Carlyle, who the great British historian and supporter of hierarchy, wrote, quote, "What great human soul, what great thought, what great noble thing that one could worship or loyally admire has ever been produced in America? None. They have begotten with a rapidity beyond recorded example 18 million of the greatest bores ever seen in the world before." And on the left, Proudhon, the first one who called himself an anarchist as a positive, says the spiritual poverty of the Americans becomes evident in their morals. What in fact is American society is composed of commoners who have suddenly acquired wealth. Now fortune, far from civilizing men, most often brings out their vulgarity. And another quote from him, "But what is a people if it has no philosophy, no art, no rational ideas of law and morality? It seems to me that the Americans neglect these things too much, and this is the reason why, in spite of their dollars and their pride, they rank last among the nations." Last. No philosophy, no art, no rational ideas of law and morality. Okay. So that's the third period. The fourth period is America as technology. And this has roots in the end of the 19th century and really comes to fruition in the 20th century. See, America as technology, and America is not just sort of a future to be accepted, but to really be fought. And it originates with the radical right. So there's a traditional right that wants to go back to the old hierarchies, and then there's a radical right that wants to set up new hierarchies for the future, such as Nietzsche and Arthur Muller-Vandenbroek. Nietzsche calls America a spiritual crisis and, quote, the coming future. Quote, "The breathless haste with which they, the Americans, work, the distinctive vice of the New World, is already beginning ferociously to infect old Europe and is spreading a spiritual emptiness over the continent." Arthur Muller-Vandenbroek, who reintroduced the phrase Third Reich, says he distinguishes America from Americanism. He said America is a new land. Americanism has to be not locally but spiritually understood. For him, it wasn't such a bad thing. But then you get to Spengler, who associates the Americanism with technology and with Sovietism, and said Americanism and Sovietism are essentially the same thing. And that identification of the US and the Soviet Union is carried through in Junger, Heidegger, and the Frankfurt School. All see America as technology, all see it as indifferent from Sovietism. Now, what they mean by technology varies from thinker to thinker. Weber sees it as the iron cage of capitalism. The Frankfurt School also see it as capitalism, but a more insidious kind of capitalism that affects how you think, and it affects even science, that science isn't neutral, but is trying to break up the world in such a way to make it useful for industry, right, for capitalism. And Heidegger sees American technology as a more spiritual problem. It's not about machines and pollution, right, but is seeing the whole world as mere standing reserve. And we think that we're free when we look at a tree and say, hey, I can make that into a desk or a house or a toothpick, but in fact, we're not free because we can only envision using the thing, and it turns us into standing reserve as mere users in a technological sense. And so we are ultimately unfree and able to see being and even think of being as a problem. And even though most of these people, including Heidegger, conflate the US and Sovietism, when Heidegger has to use one name as the label for this future catastrophe, he calls it Americanism, always, and never Sovietism. Okay, so those are the four periods. Here's a first little conclusion of what I've just said. What we've seen is America condemned, praised in The Noble Savage and the American Revolution, and then condemned again. And we've seen America transformed in European eyes in two totally opposite ways. First, America as nature, Europe's pet, Yeah, first America is Europe's past, right, and the Indians, then it becomes its future, total opposites. Second, America is seen as the past as nature, as natural, but also then it becomes technological in the 20th century, total opposites. I want to say 4 things about this pattern. First, since Columbus, European descriptions of America have been fantastical, inaccurate, and often intentionally so. Second, technology is there from the beginning. Columbus exploits. He doesn't see what it is, right? This is long before America. You can't blame America for the technological mindset. That is a European phenomena, or rather, it's modernity, or something even more universal. And in blaming America for modernity, it misses the mark, that the US and modernity are not equal and coeval sets. The US is in some ways more religious than Europe, as they like to point to us, and they're religious, and George Bush and our politicians talk about religion. Isn't that crazy? And Europe, on the other hand, likes to tell us sometimes about how proud they are. Their GDP, the GDP of the EU exceeds the US, and this kind of thing, right? So they're proud of their own modernity sometimes. But fourthly, and most importantly, I want to note a fundamental substantive similarity that goes throughout all of these periods, the Indians and the US. That the Indians are described basically as sort of brutes and naive innocents. And that's more or less what Europe thinks of the US today, right? How does it think of us? Naive, innocent, childlike, simple, direct, brutish, stupid, crude, vulgar, shallow, lacking spirituality, even though they point to our religiosity. Now, our society might be all these things. I would argue no more than most and a lot less than others. And the French and German thinkers who point the finger at the US, they should look at their own societies, the horrors that come out of Germany in the last 100 years, and the buffoonery and impotence that's come out of France since the French Revolution. But the real point is, though, that even if we are all those things, if the Indians and the US, which are such different ways of life, are represented in fundamentally the same way, there's a problem with the nature of the representation. And what I argue is that the Indians and the US are not, in fact, the same, but Europe is imposing the same thing on America as the opposite of Europe. Europe is still sort of the same thing, struggling, right? And it is looking for some other, and that's what it imposes on America. And this is captured by a postmodern thinker named Jean Baudrillard. He's not read here, is he? Jean Baudrillard? Yeah, he's not worth reading. I read him so you don't have to. He's a very clever guy, but totally lacking in moral seriousness. And he says about the US, "For me, there is no truth of America." But he also writes, "I knew all about this nuclear form, this future catastrophe, when I was still in Paris, of course. Of course." Right? So there is no truth, but he knows everything, all the truth about America while he's still in Paris. But basically what he did was he came to the US and he rents a car and he drives around and he's like driving through the desert and it's like, emptiness, space, the abyss, this is America. And he drives and he gets to Los Angeles and it's like the buildings are tall and shiny and reflective and this is superficial, this is America. That's only a bit of a caricature of what he does. So it's a book called America. And in there, he describes the US as the original version of modernity and the only remaining primitive society. In fact, he calls it the primitive society of the future, that is fundamentally primitive and utopia achieved. Right? So he takes all the images of America, because this is how he's clever, and he combines them all in the same kind of mishmash. He also says about the US that Europe possesses the art of thinking, or as opposed to Europe that possesses the art of thinking, he says, I ask of the Americans only that they be Americans. I do not ask them to be intelligent, sensible, original. He also, when he was in California, he says, this is a quote, "Everywhere you go, you always hear the same question. What are you doing after the orgy?" Anyone here from California? Raise your hands. Have you uttered that phrase? Have you heard anyone else utter that phrase? I spent a year there. No one asked me that. There is a semi-serious point here, and that what he's trying to say is that in America, it's the land where we have all this material stuff, and so it leads us to be dissatisfied, right? So the orgy, that should be this like totally exhausting and fulfilling thing, right? It's like, there you are, it's like, you know, in the middle of the orgy, what are you doing afterwards? You know, you want to get a drink? Right, so you're not enjoying anything. And that's how he characterizes modernity. And he says that is America's problem, and through America, it becomes the whole world's problem. Now, here's my epilogue. I want to just bring this up through 9/11, the reactions of 9/11. And in the postmodern world, there was a huge debate over what happened in 9/11. And what the debate consisted of is whether the attacks amounted to an event. This word event is the key word. And an event is not going shopping, it's not seeing your mother, going to a party. An event is a discourse-changing thing. It comes out of Heidegger originally. And an event is what all the postmoderns strive for. And what they say is that every time is dominated by a discourse. Right? If you know Plato's Republic, it's the cave of the time. It's the discourse, that it gets into everybody's head and makes them unfree. And an event is something that smashes the discourse. That's what they mean. And what they think, you can't really smash it from the outside, but what you have to do is to look for internal contradictions and point them out, and the thing implodes on itself. And that's what all postmodern literary criticism is about, showing you the contradictions within the author in order to undermine their power and the hegemony of their thought over us. But in asking whether 9/11 was an event, what they're asking is, does 9/11 have the power to change the discourse that controls us? Now, if it does, it has to be a good thing, right? Because it will free us. Now, there's a whole big debate, and I won't go through everything, but I'll just talk a little bit about the same Baudrillard who I just talked about, who traveled in America. And for Baudrillard, the discourse that he sees as dominating our age is globalization. And he interprets 9/11 as, quote, triumphant globalization battling itself, because the terrorists were created by a contradiction within globalization. And because it comes from within globalization, we are complicit in the attacks. He writes, they did it, but we wished for it, because we all want to smash the discourse that holds us down. And he says that it's just that 9/11 was a manifestation of the suicidal tendencies of the West. And his evidence of our suicidal tendencies are movies like The Towering Infernos. We make a movie where these big buildings burn, that's what we really want in reality. It's a very sophisticated argument. That's sarcasm. So how does Baudrillard interpret the terrorists? Here's a handful of quotes. This is a new terrorism that lays hold of the rules of the game solely with the aim of disrupting it. Right? What do the terrorists want? They don't want to take power or impose anything. They just solely with the aim of disrupting it. The action of the terrorist does not seek the impersonal elimination of the other. Right? So the terrorists are somehow supporting the other in doing what they're doing and in their motives. That they want to radicalize the world situation, radicalize the relation of the image to reality. I never heard any jihadists talking about that, but that they want to resuscitate both images and events, just like the events of 1968 in France, which is the great moment of French leftism. Now, it never occurs to Baudrillard that fully 2 of the 4 attacks were not on the World Trade Towers, right? That's globalization, but on the Pentagon and the Capitol, which are American. And his account of the terrorists seems so implausible, but what's going on? I think he is reading himself into the terrorists, right? This is what postmodern thinkers want to do, is to reconfigure the relation of image and reality while protecting the other and all of this. And so there's a kind of abstractness and a kind of dishonesty and projecting himself into all of this that is just unbelievable. And Baudrillard actually wrote in another piece that he would be a terrorist if death had any meaning. Oh, just one last quote from him. He says, "The horror of the 4,000 victims of dying in those towers was inseparable from the horrors of living in them." Why? Because they not only did mental conditioning, but air conditioning. That's true, that's his argument. Okay, so that brings us up to today. So I want to just conclude with a few thoughts. In the last 10 years or so, Americans have felt a lot of hostility coming out of Europe, especially from the elites. And this raises the question, like, why do they dislike us? And the first answer that's usually given is, well, it's because of our participation in the Iraq wars, Afghanistan, not going along with the Kyoto Environmental Treaty or the ICC or the Landmines Treaty and all of that, as if it was simply a reaction to those few things that we did. But you can go back a few administrations to the Clinton administration, and during the Clinton administration, the intellectuals weren't much more happy with us. Euro Disney went into France then, and Jean Caux, who was Sartre's personal secretary, called it a cultural Chernobyl, a construction of hardened chewing gum and idiotic folklore written for obese Americans. As you say, well, maybe Europe is mad at us because of Vietnam, and we did some pretty bad things in Vietnam. And the Montrelon quote that I mentioned at the beginning was right from the beginning of the Vietnam era. But even before that, Sartre, Beauvoir, Camus, the Frankfurt School were viciously condemning America and as terrible imperialists. Okay, so maybe it was because of our actions in World War II. Well, you can understand why maybe some Germans would be angry about that, but the French, we liberated them, right? And in fact, if you look at opinion polls right after World War II, in the difference between elites and not as defined by education level, the elites, the masses in France loved America, and we were very popular. But among the elites, even in the few years after World War II, and while we're starting up the European community and giving them all the Marshall Plan and all of that, among the elites, we're still like 90% negative. So okay, must have been because of something we did before World War II. Maybe World War I, the first time that we went into the European continent. But no, you have to go, Nietzsche and all of this goes before that. And my conclusion is, it's not about something that we did. It's what we are. Or since what they say is inaccurate, it's what we represent to them, their future and modernity. And in recent times, it's primarily been a leftist discourse that's been in Europe that's been anti-American. And one of the things that I want to point out here is that this is merely an accident, that if you go back before World War II, the right hates America in the same exact way. And it's only an accident that Hitler so discredits the intellectual right after World War II that it ceases to exist, really. And in the left, they're viciously anti-American, and in part also because they're pro-Soviet. But when the horrors of the Soviet Union start getting revealed, they pull away slowly from the Soviet Union. Sartre doesn't renounce the Soviet Union until 1968, the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Forget the 48 invasions and the 56 invasions and Khrushchev's revelation about Stalin's crimes. You could stomach that. So it's just an accident that there's no intellectual right in the post-war period. And I think if you look back further, these anti-American, anti-modern, what I argue, exist on the right too. And why is this? It's because intellectuals on the far left and the far right are anti-modern. And they don't like the liberal modernity that the US represents. They want something radically different. And the problem for the United States in Europe is that there's been very few liberal intellectuals, liberal philosophers in the past 150 years. And if you look just, let's say, in the 20th century, who is there? In France, there's Raymond Aron. In Britain, Oakeshott, Popper, Isaiah Berlin. In Germany, Habermas, at least in his constitutional moments, and Sternberger. In Italy, Croce. It's like one thinker in a century who's a major liberal voice. All the others are on the far left and the far right. So as a final conclusion, what I would like the European thinkers to do is to call a spade a spade. Since it's modernity that you don't like, attack that. Don't just blame it on America. Then you alienate Americans who might also have problems with modernity. Now, on the one hand, I don't begrudge them if they're trying to create some space to wrestle with a problem. Okay, it's easier to say the problem comes from without, and it's not because of us or thinkers that earlier European philosophers or decisions that earlier European philosophers and statesmen had made. So okay, if they want to blame it on America to create some space to operate, well, okay, I don't begrudge them that. But then you have this reservoir of anti-Americanism, and when policy issues come up that do form a tension across the Atlantic, then all of this bile comes out and makes it a problem. So in the future, do I expect there to be some kind of a fundamental break between Europe and America? No, I don't, because I think we share more our common liberal modernity than we do, than either of us do with all the rest of the world. But to the extent that America is more modern and owns it and is technological and willing to pay for the armies and things that Europe isn't, there will continue to be a tension. So I thank you for your attention.